We are live. Hello, hello, and welcome to the Literary Roadhouse Book Club. Today we're discussing Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. I'm Anais, joined by Gerald Hornsby and Colette Sartor. Hey guys!
Hello.
Hey.
Hi! So excited.
Yeah.
Especially
Yes.
since we spent like 10 minutes discussing it before recording. We're like, oh, we should record.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we got to do that.
Yeah.
Right, we're here to talk on air, not off air.
Really? Oh, okay.
Sign of a good book, though, that gets you
Yeah.
thinking. So, what did you guys think of the book overall? Gerald.
Yeah. I liked it. I was surprised how short it was. I thought it was going to be a long book. It was really well written, very easy to read, and I liked what he did. So yeah, enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, thoroughly. I mean, I agree. I was surprised at how short it was because it seemed like a book that would have been much, much longer given given the topic. And yet it felt like the right length for the way the book was written. And it did. I had a professor once used to say it read like a shot. And it did. It read like a shot. I couldn't put it down. So I found myself doing that instead of the work I was supposed to be doing, reading the book, because I really enjoyed it. I think he's a fascinating writer, and the juxtaposition of the style, with which he chose to write it and the topic that he took on was really wonderful. It had great results.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the style, because that's what made the earliest impression on me about this book, was just how this is a book that could very easily become a sort of like grief porn or a torture porn or an exploitation porn. It can very quickly be about the suffering and this and that. And while all that suffering is there, he never dwells on it from an emotional point of view. And it's very much this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Yeah.
It's haunting in the way he does it, right? Because he never tells you to feel bad, but he says these things so casually. You're just like, oh my God.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because I didn't know what it was about. I haven't read any reviews or anything. So I was reading something, and then he talked about the apartment being in an alleyway where it's right for machine guns and this sort of thing. I think, what?
Yeah.
Why? Why is he talking about that? I had no idea. And he just it's very much like The Milkman in that way, that he describes the violence very, very simply and just matter of factly. It's just that happened. And even like Saeed's mother, when she gets killed, she gets killed.
That's the point. Yeah, where it really hit me. This is a very it's the remove of the point of view. It's that omniscient narration that allows us that creates some distance and that fable-like quality, so that you've got that juxtaposition of the fable tone with the horrific circumstances, and you feel hard. We know enough about Saeed's mother that we mourn her, but it just comes along so casually, and this is their everyday lives. Yeah. So it really does mimic that. Oh, this is life. There's nothing outside of this for them.
Yeah. It is funny. It's it's not a Bruce Willis movie. It could because the violence happens, but that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is the life surrounded by the violence and the things that the violence causes the characters to do, not the violence itself. So very, very well done.
Yeah.
And also the things that the violence can't extinguish. Love still happens. And just the fact that Saeed's father stays because he can't leave his wife. He knows the danger. He knows he's going to die, either, most likely by violence, but who knows? And yet he stays because that is his life.
But also, Saeed's father stays for two reasons. There's that reason. He doesn't want to leave his wife, whose presence is still there, even though she has passed. But then there's the other part that made my eyes sting with tears, which is he knows that Saeed and Nadia's chances of survival will be diminished if he doesn't leave them. And I'm like, oh my God, like that, like just, it got me.
Yeah.
Good.
And I think it's one of the sort of side effects of having children is that, especially when the children grow up, is that you would do whatever you need to do for the children, and the realization that if it came to it, your life is unimportant compared to theirs, so you would do that for your kids.
Yeah, that got to
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, there are some who would not,
Yeah.
but I love this character because he does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he even leaves the house because he knows it would be harder for them to leave if he's still in the house and they have to exit the house and he's behind them. So he goes for a walk, so it makes it easier for them to go. Just like everything about that moment where they have to leave him and he wants them to and they don't want to, it's just like so heartbreaking.
That's so clever for Hamid to bring that out and to notice that, and you think, yes, well spotted. That is exactly what would happen.
Yeah. So this book, we're talking about actually the transition between what I consider like two halves of the book. The first half of the book, it's here's a city in an unnamed country, but we can assume it's a Middle Eastern, it's an Arab country, and it's more or less cosmopolitan, not very wealthy, but functioning, and war's coming in, and the militants are coming in. And then the second part is the two main characters, Nadia and Saeed, being refugees. So how do the two halves of the book, how does the plot differ, or even the themes or focus change in those two halves? Because to me, it felt very distinct. I don't know if it felt as distinct for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, they're literally walking through a door, and I love the doors. I know we'll talk about that later, but the book is very distinctly divided into war versus refugee, and concerns. You do see the concern shift because as the militants take over, they're part of the city. Life becomes harrowing. Violence dictates everything they do. Even where they live, and Nadia moves in with them, after Saeed's mother dies. It's she's not safe anymore. It's not just I want to care for them. It's okay, I have to admit this is not safe anymore, even though it's usually normally would not be safe for me to be living with them because we're not married. But the second half, the safety, and I mean, there's always that undercurrent of are we safe once the refugees, but it's the concerns change. The concerns become more emotional and more individuated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I listened to an interview with him, and I think he was in the first location. I think he was thinking about Lahore in Pakistan, but he didn't want to call it Lahore because of what happens to the city. He doesn't want to have that happen to a city he loves. So I think it may be a city like Lahore, but it's and it is very different once they start going through the doors. You then see. I wondered whether they'd come full circle because exit west, so they keep jumping west to different places and end up back where they started from, and you're sort of always looking for safety, for a good feeling about where you live, and in actual fact they sort of they come right back because that's where they're from.
Home.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's kind of, I mean, and I don't mean to at all diminish this book, but it's that Wizard of Oz. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. But it's a much edgier, more bittersweet feeling in this book because, by the end, they're so much older and they've come home, but they haven't, because they can't. They're with each other, but they're not going back. Everyone's a refugee through time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you see by the end. And oh my God, that last line killed me, but I guess we'll get there.
Yeah. So, for me, one of the things I really liked about the first half of the book is the way that we were saying he would without fanfare, without any histrionics, tell you what's happening. And it would always come back to how does this couple that's falling in love still do the things they want to do as much as they can safely. So it's like, oh, here's this new challenge. Here's how the lovers overcame that. Here's this challenge. Here's how they overcame that. In the beginning, it was just purely cultural. It was, oh, Saeed can't come up into the home of an unmarried woman. or she's telling people she's
Right.
rich, or she's not. So she drops down a robe for him to put on, so people think he's a woman, so he can come upstairs. It's his sister, right? Like they have all these little things, and then it changes. Then it's, okay, well, there's a blockade on this street, or the military have taken over this zone. So instead, like all the different ways that this couple who's falling in love still find a way to be together and to develop that relationship during wartime. And that's the part that I think for me gave me like that frisson. Like I was just like, oh my God, like that's the part and that was so clever, just so clever of Hamid to write it that way, because it's the focus on just the couple falling in love instead of just like, how do you live your life? How do you get food? Stuff like you could have taken it in a more mundane direction, but taking it in this one, trying to put a romance in a war setting was just genius. Like I thought that was the genius of the first half.
Well, it's a great hook. It's a great way to keep us reading, because we all want to, you want to read a love story, a challenged love story. Mm-hmm. And it also, I think, helps emphasize that how the everyday normality of violence is growing. Mm-hmm. It really, you're right. It's a really specific way of doing that.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
And then in the second half, I like that you brought up that concept of going home. Because in the end, I don't know if you guys read it the same way, but my sense was that Nadia was going back for the first time in 50 years, but Saeed had been there for a while, is the way that I read it. Like she was visiting and she got something on her phone that said, oh, he's nearby. They didn't plan this, but of course he's there. Because when they were first fleeing the city, what Saeed was most fearful of was leaving his family and his friends and the only home he's ever known behind. And Nadia didn't really have that concern because Nadia didn't really have a great relationship with her family. She had already lost touch with them. Her thing was her fear of losing her autonomy, which was very important to her, and of being forced to rely on, the mercy of others. And that's what she feared the most. And I think that also plays a role in when they come home and the way that they even sort of lived as refugees. So, yeah, what do you think that says about them? And did you see that sort of play out when they were migrants?
Yeah, I think. I mean, she was always the more rebellious. He's more solid. If we assume that it's Muslim, he's more solid Muslim. He does the praying. She doesn't. She wears the cowl and the shawl, but for a practical reason. So. And I think she's the first one to swear and all this sort of stuff. And you think, yeah, she's a bit sort of more lively than he is, and he's quite staid, lives at home, and he seems to be more of a sort of a guy that likes being in his normal surroundings and surrounded by the people and things that he likes, and he still has stuff from like years ago in their apartment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I thought another interesting thing was that the difference, and that difference is so distinct in them. You're right. He's the more staid, he's the more traditional, and she is the more rebellious. And I mean, part of that is driven by gender-specific things in culture, in any culture, quite frankly. She is a woman, and she's rebelling against the impositions that her culture and, quite frankly, just being human in general imposes on women. But those differences would have still existed regardless of gender, because they are so distinctly who they are. She is by nature rebellious. We're never told what happens with the rest of her family, but the impression that I got was she was the one who left. Mm-hmm. And she had there were other siblings, but she's not just a woman; she's the only one who left. Whereas I feel like if Saeed had been a female character, he would have substantially been the same kind of person. He may have reacted, or rebelled against certain cultural norms, but he would not have been as rebellious as Nadia, because she's just a different kind. And that's something I really loved about the characterization. These people are who they are. They're not just gender stereotypes. They're not just cultural stereotypes. They're very distinctly who they are, because they're built in such a complex, fully developed way.
Yeah. And you see that difference really, there's a lot of things that drive them apart in the second half when they're refugees, and part of it is just the hardships that they're going through you're too exhausted to put in the work that it takes to maintain a relationship. But I think the other part of it is Saeed's creeping resentment that Nadia has no interest in reconnecting with migrants they find from their home country. Remember when they're in London and they have, so they're squatters in a mansion and they're in a house that's primarily Nigerians and they're the only ones who are not from Nigeria. Or not the only ones, there's a few others, but primarily it's Nigerians. And Nadia joins the Nigerian Elder Council that like sets up rules and like, settles disputes in this mansion where there's like 50 squatters. And then Saeed finds that a couple doors down, there is one that's mostly people from his country, but it's so packed that the women all sleep upstairs, the guys sleep downstairs, all in the same room. And he's like, oh, we should go move there. She's like, why? Why would we move into a place that, it's going to make us sleep apart and we have to sleep with dozens of strangers? And to him, he ends up not forcing the issue, but to him, it's like, because those are our people. Like, like to him, he's very much like, that's our tribe. That's where we belong. That's where we should be. And she was constantly like, nope, I don't care about that. And when they're in California, there's even that moment when we're closer to Nadia. So it's omniscient, but it'll take its time with each character. And when the omniscient narrator was looking at Nadia, it was talking about how she was enjoying these newfound freedoms that she had in the West, right? Whereas Saeed wasn't really, it's not that he wasn't enjoying them, but what did he do? He found a new church. He found a new, there's all these ways in which it never says that Saeed went back way earlier than Nadia, but I think he definitely had to have done,
Yeah, well, it's it's the nature of who they are. Like, again, it's that thing about what feels like home, because home is not just a geographical setting, it's contextual. It's in what type of group do I feel most comfortable? And he was looking for in the West, he was looking for a new church because he was looking for something that felt more like the life he came from. And she was seeking out something that was more like the life she had imagined and dreamed about when she was acting out in her, in her original, her home of origin. She sought out independence and freedom, even though that didn't necessarily exist. And she had to be very, very careful. So I feel like in the West, to really experience, oh, this is what I was looking for. So that when she meets the cook, and it all kind of falls into place for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I do like, because you said earlier, these characters are very nuanced and don't feel like cultural stereotypes. One thing I do like is that when they were in London and Saeed was getting close to that one group that had the imam and he felt sometimes uncomfortable by the way this guy would speak. And it sounded a little bit like the militants back home, not quite, but kind of, and it made him uncomfortable. And he felt like something was rotting inside. But then when he goes to Marin County, and then there's a different Muslim congregation there, but in this one, it's led by an African-American guy who had married a woman from his home country, which again, we don't know what it is, but we might think it's Pakistan. And then it felt different. And it's the kind of, it's the expression of the religion that he enjoys more. I thought that distinction, while a minor point, was a good one to make. Like, especially if this is a largely Western audience that's reading this book. And a lot of times the way that Islam is worshipped is sort of lumped together, but there are differences. And having him pick the one he likes best, I thought it was good. It's good for a Western audience to read that.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was very deftly portrayed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the whole thing about Saeed's religion and how devout he was and how he began to pray even more times during the day. So it's like the more that he and Nadia tended to move apart, the more he sort of retreated into his religion and took solace in that, and the preacher's daughter, of course. But
oh yes, the preacher's daughter sounded lovely.
Yes.
Well, one of the things I thought was very interesting about the portrayal of his devotion to religion was its origins. It really struck me when he was when the Yemenish narrator is telling us about how he came to start praying. He saw the comfort that his parents got from it, and he wanted to experiment with that. So it wasn't necessarily. I've had it's my own religious background. I feel like as a Catholic woman, and especially given my generation, I was, part of this organization that really kind of, you're a woman, you're dead, you're gonna. I got confirmed and I was told, oh yeah, you're 13, you're going to get married and have children soon. Well, no. But anyway, I liked the portrayal of religion as not something necessarily, yes, it was spiritual, but it was also the comfort of it, that the beliefs and the engagement with a like-minded group of people was comforting, because I think anyone, whether you believe in God or not, can relate to that, or whether you're religious or not, can relate to that. So I thought that was a nice way of making a very specific experience accessible to a wider range of readers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's quite unusual for a writer to do that. I think it's because I think it's a part of religion that isn't brought out very often, is that what effect that having that religion has on the person and their own individual feelings. And I know people who they go to church and they sing and they pray and all that sort of stuff, but what matters to them is the feeling of peace that it gives them, and the feeling of belonging in a like-minded group of people. That's most important to them.
And part of that origin story is also the part where Saeed's father takes him for the first time to pray with the other men, and he just liked the feeling like he was a man now and he's a part of this culture. So again, he's very like these are my people, right? Like that sense of belonging to this culture and these people, that was very consistent throughout his character. Yeah. I like that as well.
Yeah.
Because you can see it, like this kid who's like 12 or 13 is like, I'm a man now. Yeah. And it's also universal.
Yeah.
Yeah. True.
So the book is largely very realistic, except for the doors, right? I was reading this review on Goodreads. I gave it 1 star, and this person ranted for like 1,000 words about the doors. She hated the doors. How can you hate the doors?
Wait, what was her reasoning? Why did she hate the doors?
She just didn't like the magical realist aspect of it. She was like, oh, everything else makes sense, but then there's this random thing that doesn't make any sense. She just didn't like the magic part.
I wonder, I have to say, although, I bought it. I did.
I loved it.
Because it felt in keeping with the tone of the book, where anything, and also by the time we got to the doors, you really did feel the desperation they felt. And there was, because of that fable-like distancing, you had that sense of, okay, anything can happen. So I felt like I was able to, and I also love magical realism. So, for me, it's like, oh, because I didn't read anything about the book beforehand. So I thought, oh, okay, I didn't expect this, but okay, I'm going to go with it. And I feel like he introduced us so gradually to the fact that this was real, because it started out as a rumor. And in war times, in chaos, rumors abound, and many of them are so fantastical that you really shouldn't believe them, but you do because you're desperate. So for me, they fit into that. I can see how someone who's not as interested in magical realism, or who just completely, would say, wait, I thought this was, this isn't supposed to be here. One of these things is not like the other, and I don't like it. Because we're not set up for it. If you look at the specific details, like, how in a writing class you might hear, if you're going to have this element, you have to thread it through from the beginning. You have to set it up. And if you go back and think about the book, the only thing that really sets us up for that is that tone, that distancing tone, and also the continued fragmentation of the community, and the uncertainty that the violence creates. So I can see how someone who doesn't appreciate magical realism would be affronted, but I thought it worked. I mean, I thought that we needed those doors to continue us along a path, an unexpected path.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think they're a great construct, because, like the violence, it's not about the violence. So the traveling from place to place, it's not a travel story. It's not a struggling against the elements story. It's, let's take our characters from this situation and put them in a different situation and see what happens. So I think otherwise people, you'd have to write what, how they traveled, what ship they got, how they got there, all this sort of stuff. And that's not important. What is important is how these characters react to their new situation. And he wanted to do the several, the sort of around the world thing, and have several different situations to see what they did and how they reacted. And I think that's a great way of doing it. Just go and put them in another place.
That's such a great point. I haven't thought about it that way, but you're right. From a writerly perspective, what a great solution. Because you don't want people focusing on that actual reality of the logistics. Because that isn't the point. And ultimately, Anais, when you brought up in the questions beforehand about the woman in Palo Alto who never leaves, and yet there's that great line. The whole point of her is that we're all migrants through time. So ultimately, the author doesn't just want to look at how we get from place to place, or how migrants become refugees. When you're a refugee from a war-torn country, it's not just about that. It's about moving through time and place in general, and how that changes us, even if we don't want to be changed.
Yeah. And I think also the Doors, so a few points. One is it kind of does foreshadow when you think back to the beginning, but it's so subtle. So in the beginning, there's a lot of references to blackness that's so black and so dark that light is, can't receive it, like black holes. And the first scene, how he has all those interspersed scenes where you go and you watch someone else. And the very first one is in Australia. And there is a tan man with a beard who comes out of a very black, dark closet. And
that's right.
Bed, but he doesn't do anything to the woman. He doesn't steal anything. He just leaves. And it's very confusing the first time you read it. You're like, what? And then it's like, man, when you think about it, you're like, the Doors.
Of course.
I'm so glad you said that, because it's because I started this a while ago. I completely forgot about that. And you're right. Yeah. So in that sense, but if you're not someone who enjoys that, you're going to be frustrated. But you're right. That's a brilliant setup.
Yeah, we set that up. Yeah. Ooh, and then you think back and you're like, haha, now I understand that Australia seen that before. Yeah. Bewildering.
Yeah, because when I read that, I thought, what's he doing? Why is he just going out and coming through there and then escaping and go? Why is he doing that? And obviously you then think back when you've read a little bit further, you think back, you think, that's what he's doing. Very good.
And, and also, so Gerald, the point you made about how this isn't a story about logistics and travel, right, is a good one. And also the tone here, like I said earlier, it's not like a grief or torture porn type story. And it's really hard to keep this kind of, this happened and this happened, but here's how they coped with that. And here's what they were thinking. It's hard to do that when it's like, and they were hiding under the floor of a van cramped up with 10 other people. Like when you get to like that level, I think it becomes, first of all, like a real chore for the reader. And also you can't really keep this tone going. I think it's really difficult. Like that is so harrowing that if you have them cramped under a van and then all of a sudden it's like they had the choice to touch each other's faces, but they didn't. This is not the time for that. Like, it would feel weird. It would feel very weird. Like, why are we even thinking about that? You can only have that line when it's like, oh, they're in a tent that they set up on camp, right? Like they have sort of settled somewhere. So I really like the Doors. And also I really like the Doors because of something that Hamid said in an interview with Paste Magazine, where he said, it's strange to say, but I really believe in the Doors. I think the Doors exist in our world, just not in the physical manifestation that I give them in the novel. So what does he mean by that? Because I feel like I know what he means by that because I got that, but I don't know if it's, me overreading into this.
I don't know.
No?
Just sorry.
No.
Well, I think it has to do, I would think it has to do with this whole idea of migrant. I keep harping on this, but I really do think it's this whole idea of migrants through time, that, there are doors that we step through. We make choices and we step through certain doors in our lives and it changes us, and it doesn't have to be a geographical change, or it doesn't have to, but there is, we step into entirely new lives. And it's so much, I think we're such a product of our time because it's not the way it was for let's say our grandparents or even my parents to a certain extent, that we can say, you know, this isn't the world I want to live in, even professionally. You know, this isn't where I want to be. I'm going to open another door. You know, so for me, that's what I got from it, from that quote, when you handed us that quote, and I'm like, oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, it's much more literal than that. I think there's a way in which when you have these problems, when you have war refugees, climate change refugees, religious persecution refugees, all that sort of thing, you have these routes, you have these hidden lines that are trying to cross borders to subvert them. And there's gatekeepers to that, right? Like they find that guy who takes their money and they go to the dental office, right? Yeah, so I think it's very literal. Like it's a way to symbolize this whole sort of network of people. Like all of a sudden, once you commit to this and you pay the money and you find the person who's going to get you there, right? Like you have the coyotes in Mexico. Like once you get there is a point where you cross a door. Like you will cross that door and you are basically now on a terrible tractor beam until you get to your end spot, like they told you.
That's true, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's very much like that door, that whole magical thing is that process of you've made that choice, you've crossed that threshold, and you got spit back out the other side. And while in real life, that might take months, it's one long, continuous, harrowing experiment, and then you got spat back out like you were supposed to. And then the idea that the guards are trying to sniff them out, that's true. Like border security types, like people who are like, oh, here's a guy who's been doing this, who found a way to get people in, right? It's not a specific door, but he's like, oh, they found a new way in. They found a new route. And I think it's that. There's constantly routes popping up, and those routes are, you know, condensed into these doors. And there's guards trying to sniff them out, trying to get rid of them. And when you look at it that way, they do exist all over the place.
Oh, yeah. But and also, quite frankly, I think I do think strongly that it is also about the metaphorical door, simply because he's got all of these different, you know, because he's got the distant point of view, he can give us different perspectives, like the woman in Palo Alto, like the, you know, man that keeps coming out of the dark closet and in Australia. He can, and I didn't know how he felt about all of the little tiny, like the family. There's the family who comes out in, I forget which country. It's one of the first times we see a door, and they're kind of walking around, and the police come up to them and take them into custody and take them. So, you know, you've got all these, pardon?
Are they in Dubai?
Yes, they're in Dubai. You're right.
Yeah.
And so you've got all these different little perspective shifts to different people going through different doors. And there were enough of them that I stopped trying to keep track of how they fit together. I could see how they fit in this specific moment, but that was one of the things I did find frustrating. I didn't know I think those little pieces were meant to create a thread that you followed throughout the story, and they did, but it didn't feel quite connected enough for me to justify having multiple. And it's just that's a stylistic preference for me. I'm not a huge fan of an omniscient point of view here. I thought it was really successful, but yeah, those shifts I found a little disruptive sometimes.
Really, because I like them because I like that that's not over focus on this one. There's these kinds of migrants all over the place for different reasons. Yeah. And also the idea that you don't know where the door is going to spit you out was a good way of saying, like, when you are fleeing something, it's not like there's a list of potential shady characters, and you're like, it's not like you're like on the Expedia.com of refugees going, oh, I'm going to go to Greece. Oh, I'm going to go to Dubai. I'm going to go to Australia. Like, really, whoever you find, wherever they're going to spit you back out, like, listen, I can get you to Australia. You're going to come or you're not. And that's the only person you found. You're going to Australia now, right? And I think that's why there's that quality of, like, they don't know where they're going to get spit back out, and it's everywhere. And it's a good way of also reminding you, like, it's not always just the Western countries. That someone else gets spit out in Buenos Aires. Like, there's this sense of, any place where there's like an opportunity or some sort of relative safety is a place where these migrants are going to get spit back out. And they don't really have a choice all the time. It's whoever was put in front of you, who gave you a potential route somewhere, that's what you take.
You just take it, yeah. It was a great way to teach us the rules of the world, definitely. Yeah. I guess I was just looking for, I would have liked more connective tissue. And I do see, I see why he did it that way. It's just stylistically not something I'm always in love with, to have that many shifts, but it did work. It was very, very helpful in helping us understand how that world, how the doors work. And it was a great way for us to see the different countries, because let's face it, our main characters don't go everywhere. They can't. That like from a craft perspective, from a writing perspective, it's just impossible. So it was a nifty little way to do it.
Yeah. So it was blending fiction and nonfiction throughout. And there were some parts of the nonfiction that surprised me. Like, I feel like I also learned things. Like, I was reading like a news article, right? Did you guys have that where you're like, oh, really, that happened? Yeah. Yeah? Go ahead, Colette. You're like bursting.
Oh, seriously, there were times when I had to stop myself, because one of the bad things about reading on a Kindle is that you can, especially on my iPad, is that I can go online and say, fact check, you know, and I try not to do that when I'm reading fiction, but I find myself doing it more and more, especially when I know something's based in fact. And this, I had to keep telling myself, don't do it, because that ruins the effect of the book. But I would find myself saying, especially when we were in their home city, oh, let me go look that up. Did that actually? I'm like, no, wait. He specifically didn't put us in a specific city. Don't go looking. You're going to ruin it for yourself.
Yeah. Gerald, was there anything where you were like, wait, did that really happen? And you learned something?
No, I think I just put myself in a fictional world. Yes, I think the most interesting thing is when they jumped into London, and so I could sort of understand the cultural references and the way in which they were treated by the sort of indigenous population, but then they everything was then fictional. So I don't know. I didn't really pick up anything factual other than you know the locations.
Well, that's the thing. The London ones where it happened to me, there really were migrant squatters in those mansions. So it's mostly mansions that were like owned by like Russian oligarchs and stuff, people who are never there year round, and they're empty. And that was like a real thing. And I saw this photo online of like these Libyans who were in this mansion who were escaping dictatorship. And I'm like, oh, this is a real thing. And I think he maybe exaggerated the scale of it, or he exaggerated, but like that really happened. Like that blew my mind.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah, wild. Yeah, he definitely exaggerated, because when I went looking, it wasn't like entire neighborhoods have been taken over from migrants. Like it wasn't like that level. But yeah, there were mansions that were taken over by migrant squatters. And I was like, what?
Okay. I love that section of the book, because I didn't expect the resolution. I didn't expect to see, you know, the military perspective back off. You know, because that's compromise that we aren't seeing lately in our own world.
Yeah.
So to see someone take the both practical and humane perspective about how to solve this situation, instead of saying, okay, let's just go in and flatten everybody and take back our neighborhood. It was heartening. It was hopeful to me.
Yeah. And then there's also I found real quick with the mansions, it wasn't like there was like police and riot gear with tanks coming in, but there were like it was cute. It was like the London cops like knocking on the door, talking to people, and these photos. Like it felt very British to me.
and I suppose if that really happened, then yeah, the cops would know this is owned by some Russian oligarch. Nobody lives there. So why not let people live there? You know, the coppers are going to be in this sort of, you know, this situation where they think, you know, yes, it's illegal, but you know, who cares?
And like what you're saying is they know their job is to get them out of there, but maybe in their hearts they're like,
yeah,
feel like a huge crime. Yeah.
But
yeah, that blew my mind that actually happened.
Yeah.
I don't think the camps though for building their own homes in the London Halo, that's not true. I couldn't find that anywhere.
No.
But was an interesting sort of solution, you know, like not a great one, but that something was sort of being done was interesting. Especially because it's very easy to paint all of the countries everybody flees to with a very heavy brush. But he gave the response from the natives different color.
Yeah, and I thought that was quite interesting that after the initial attempt to get people out, and everyone backs off and think, oh, let's just think about this. I think it's very clever, but still the migrants had to build their own houses, and it was hard work, and it was long hours, and they lived in this huge sort of dome tenty type thing. So they weren't being treated particularly well, but they, you know, the indigenous population were sort of trying to do something practically to help them. So that was very good. I was quite impressed with that.
Yeah. So we're talking about London because he named London, but he was very careful with names, right? So when it came to cities, he named all the cities except the home city. And when it came to characters, he only named Nadigan Saeed and no one else. But there were other characters as well. So yeah, why do you think he did that? I actually can't figure it out. So it's a genuine question.
Yeah, I think it's to keep the focus on them. I think it's like when kidnappers, or hostage situation, you want the hostage takers to recognize that the people they've taken hostage are people, so use their names and refer to them and this sort of thing. So I think it's a bit like that. It's a bit like, as the reader, keeping your focus on these two people, getting us engaged with them. Everyone else is interesting anecdotes and interesting sort of setups for the locations and the plot, but I think it's just so that we've totally focused on their relationship going forward.
Yeah, and it does totally focus us on them. I think also it keeps that fable-like quality. It goes along with the stylistic choices he made, which was to immediately set up this sense of we're unsettled by the fact that we know we're somewhere specific. I mean, the city is their home city is very specifically rendered, so we know we're someplace specific, but it's unnamed, and that's unsettling. And the thing I love about that is that everything feels so real, and yet there's this otherworldly quality, and in a sense that does do a great job of setting us up for the Doors too, because anything can happen in a world where that's so specific and yet unnamed. It's an unsettling but really appropriate feeling, I think, for the subject matter.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, it sort of made me think. I agree that it keeps with the style and the sort of fable-like quality by only naming them. But a lot of times fables don't name places either because they're not actually rooted in our world. But if you're trying to make some commentary about what's happening in our world and you want to root it, then there is a benefit to saying London, Mykonos, Marin. Yeah, because if he had kept it very sort of loose, and it was just this city, that city, this, then you don't have the benefit of making that. You can't. It's harder to make that point. Like, guys, this is really happening. That sucks, right? Like that very pointed attack.
Well, and also by not naming the war-torn city, it could be any city. I mean, it is very specific, where it's clear that it's a very specific city, but still, I found that all I could think was the everyday details of what it was like to live in a city that got more and more violent really did make me think about, oh, now I can see how this would affect me if it were happening in my own city, and why I might not leave, and why I might wait it out. And it actually made me more fearful and more paranoid about, wow, this really could happen anywhere. And then to bring in the specific cities about where you can flee to, then we move into that different part of the book, which is, we want to be more specific. We want to be set in the real world, because then we can see, okay, anywhere, if you're going to leave a war-torn place, which could be my place, what are the specific places you would go to, and what would be the effect of that? And what is the effect of going to a very specific place that we know about and that we know the details about, we know are real, is a real place.
And do you think that by naming those places, he put them in specific situations so that each place treated them and they felt different to the other places? And I wonder whether there's some through line, because it's exit west, so they keep going west, whether there's some sort of more Western attitude or something. I don't know. don't think I picked that up, but there's certainly the way they live in the different places is very, very different.
It gets better and better for them, right?
Mm.
Every time they find a new place. And I don't think necessarily it's because it's going west. I think it's because of the very specific places that he chose. Like, I wouldn't think it would necessarily be better across all parts of the United States, but California, definitely, because California has taken in the most refugees of any state and has actually had some programs to help them. There's various active nonprofits down there. So making it California was a good choice, because you can imagine that in some other states it wouldn't be as welcoming. But still not the level of like discord that we saw when they were in Greece. That was probably the roughest section, right?
Yeah.
But also Greece has way more refugees than the United States. By the time you get over here, it's a lot fewer. So there's, as you go further and further, there's the benefit of having fewer and fewer people, and also different policies that you're going into. So when you end up in California, it made sense to me that California was like a decent place to, like, try to restart.
Well, also you've got that there's that cultural difference between where they started and where they end up in California. The two societal influences are so very different, right. And yet Saeed and Nadia become more and more themselves, and more. They really fully evolve into who they were becoming anyway in their city of origin, which I thought was a great way to say it's not. Wherever you are, you'll become who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was that quote early on that was, war in Saeed and Nadia's city revealed itself to be an intimate experience. I really like that line. So he keeps juxtaposed, because he's focused on a romance, between intimacy and war, or lack thereof, right? So what does that sort of say about the nature of war? I don't know. It made me think about a lot of stuff. I don't know if you guys latched onto that line like I did.
Yeah, I think it just showed that a love affair between two people can exist in different places, in different with different difficulties caused by war and aggression. So I think, again, the focus on the two of them and their story together, and I think there's, as the further they go west, there's less disruption. There's the countries are more welcoming, and they're more practical places for them to live, so that when they do end up in California, it's a much more peaceful and accommodating place than the other places. So I feel that maybe there's this sort of progression that as your relationship develops, because it's started in a place that's full of difficulties, that there's a chance for it to develop in other places too.
Colette, I don't know if you have.
Well, and it's interesting. There's you've got this romance, the intimacy of love developing in a violent area. There's an intimacy to love, but there's also equal intimacy, a horrific one, but there's an intimacy in violence and aggression. And so there's a parallel. I mean, obviously those intimacies collide, but there's also a weird parallel between the intimacy of love and the intimacy of aggression. And you see that by putting this couple falling in love in a war-torn area and then taking them out of it and moving them into still aggressive situations, but progressively less so that then we can develop a different understanding of how the intimacy of violence has changed and shaped them and stayed with them, even as they move into less and less violent places.
I think for me, the line had many meanings. One, it's their personal intimate experience with each other. Two, it's the intimacy between the militants and the government. Like, these are people who they know each other very well. It's the way the militants come in, it's extremely personal. It's people from the inside. It's people who really understand your culture and are coming at it from a very it's like rotting from the inside, and it's very invasive, the way that they just go into people's homes, go into people's neighborhoods, take over a lot of things. And also there's the way that, because this war is civil. I think a civil war has that intimate feeling as well of like fighting your own brothers. So yeah, I like the idea that yeah, I don't know how to explain it. Like that the war is so horrific because it's civil, because people know each other, because it's happening on the inside, and your enemy knows you so well. Like there's like that part of it that it made me think of all of those things, which I liked a lot. But the other migrants weren't all necessarily fleeing civil war. There was some that were fleeing natural catastrophe. I think one of them was talking about like rising sea levels, beds going dry, farmland drought, stuff like that. So some of them were climate change migrants. And some of them were like there was a reference to the Rohingya, so that's religious persecution. So there was all these different reasons. But one of the migrants, the one that Colette keeps returning to in Palo Alto, she was born, raised, then raised her own families. This old lady in Palo Alto who's never left her house, and she is also described as a migrant. So Colette, I get the sense that you like that perspective.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating because I wouldn't have thought of that on my own. You know, it wouldn't have occurred to me within this book the fact that the natives of each area that we go to in their own way, and she specifically exemplifies it, and I loved her. I loved her for that reason, because there's that whole idea that she didn't move, and yet everything around her has changed. You know, she's always been there, everything has changed, and she doesn't fit the way she always did. She looks around and she fits in less than everyone else does, because in fact, she's become a migrant in her own city of origin. And I thought that was really fascinating, because that is what happens. And that is why after you've lived someplace for a long time, you start crumbling. Oh, it didn't used to be this way. I find myself doing that.
Yes.
I'm becoming the neighborhood grump.
Yeah. Gerald, did you like that point of view?
Yes, I did. I think I think it's quite interesting that that he shows. Yeah, he showed the Palo Alto woman as being somebody different but the same, and it's got this sort of undertone of we're all migrants. So I quite like that. I quite like that feeling that and we have that here, that you know, we're a right mongrel race, and yet so many people identify with being British. It's, you know, we are British, and also in America, you know, practically everyone over there is an immigrant, and yet they sort of take on the sort of mantle of the country that they're living in. But underneath it all, we're all migrants, and we've all traveled here in our past from other places.
So I'm like torn about it. On the one hand, I enjoyed what Colette said. I would have thought of that on my own. I thought it was very smart, well observed, this idea. And there's also the sense of like, as your life unfolds, and whether you stay in one place or you're forced to move, things are changing. Your life's changing. You're just trying to make it. We're all just like, there's this sense of like, we're all just trying to make it. We're all just trying to live and adapt to the changes that come into our lives, no matter how they came into our lives. The only reason I didn't like it was I felt like some sort of, if you're trying to equate the woman in Palo Alto who chose to stay there has never been forced from her home due to horrors with these people who are forced from their home due to horrors, there's a dilution of the harms that are being done. That it's not that I get what he's saying. I like it. I like the idea that we're all migrants and therefore we should cut everyone some slack. But on the other hand, there's a completely different set of cards here that I felt like that distinction needs to be preserved. The fact that these people are not migrants because, oh, what's California like, but because they're running away from horrors is something that we shouldn't necessarily lose sight of. Not that this book did or anything, but, you know, it's a little bit like, this is such a random out of nowhere, but like when words become sort of diluted, right? So we use the word war now. Everything's a war on something. So the term war lost some of its power. Or anything, something bad, like invasive happens. Sometimes people casually use the word rape, like, you know, for something that's not. And I read this article the day that was railing against how like the diet industry is using body positivity to sell diet pills, like all this kind of thing. Like you start to dilute that original word. or the original sentiment. And I don't think it should happen here because like being a refugee, I get what he's saying.
I agree. Yeah. Well, if you look, it's funny because when I originally quoted or kind of referred back to, because you had raised the Palo Alto scene, and I just thought it was such an interesting thing to look back at. So I'd gone back and looked and like looked at the passage, and when I at the top of our hour, I kind of tried to quote that line. I said, "We're all refugees through time," but then when I went back and looked at it, he's very careful. That line is actually, we are all migrants through time.
Yeah.
So I agree. There's a big distinction that does get to that. You're right. I didn't think of it that way. It does get diluted. And it actually kind of ties into, I wonder what would have happened if all of these little almost vignettes that he drops in about the different non-main characters moving around time or moving in time and place and the little family who winds up in Dubai and they're kind of mystified. They're walking along the beach. I wondered if he had created more connectivity between those little vignettes, if it would have had a different effect. Because maybe one of the reasons this one scene evokes that kind of reaction is because it feels a little bit unmoored because we're not close to this character at all. We really know nothing about her.
Yeah.
And it's the same with all the other ones. So just a thought about structure.
Yeah. I did like them, but I agree there was no connective tissue. And sometimes he would get like really into some of them, like the couple in Amsterdam, the guys coming from Brazil, the old couple, like I was like, this is a really red and long one. Like that one had a whole thing. Like so it's like, which was fine. I enjoyed reading it, but it also did feel a bit like that one in particular. Like I don't know how that one connects to anything else because this guy was like a temp worker type, or like somebody who goes to Amsterdam, works, goes back to Brazil, comes back, works, go back to Brazil. I didn't really understand that one. It seems like that guy's probably traveling through legal means. It doesn't have the same feeling as some of the other ones, or like semi-legal means. Like the door metaphor there didn't really quite work out.
Well, yeah, and you've kind of and there in particular, you feel the authorial hand. That's when it got a little harder for me. Just that, there were moments where those little scenes, those little vignettes felt intrusive enough that I thought to myself, oh, this is him establishing rules. This is him, the author, establishing rules, the rules of how this works, as opposed to I'm still in this seamless world, fictive world that I don't want to leave. So they popped me out in a way that I didn't like because I would start thinking about why the scene was there as opposed to just being immersed in this world that I didn't want to leave.
Yeah. No, for me, I think it is partially establishing rules, but not just that. I think it's also just he really wants to tell the story. Like it came into his mind and he really wants to tell it. And it's like, take all of these, make a short story anthology. It'd be great. It has a nice theme, but you don't need necessarily connective tissue. They stand on their own. Yeah.
Oh, that's so true because I'm so used to thinking about craft from a short storyteller's perspective that I look at those and I'm like, I forget that the novel is generally more forgiving. It's a more forgiving form, so you can get away with more. So that stuff really does kind of jar me. You're really just think about that might
That's your dog, yeah.
So sorry. I didn't realize he was there. I've been ignoring him too long. Keep going.
Okay.
Well, we are coming up to an hour, aren't we?
Yeah, we're coming up on the hour. All I was going to ask for my last question is the book hopeful or not? I don't know.
I think it is because they survive. And although their relationship, their sort of romance breaks up in the States and they go their separate ways, they come back together in the end, and they still have a lot of affection for each other, I think. And they're living different lives, but there's still something between them, I think. So, yeah, it's positive. They don't die, so that's good.
Would you say, yeah,
they don't die.
Would you say the book ends on a hopeful note?
Bittersweet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that last line broke
not
apart.
Real sweetness in it. Well, hold on. I found I'd go to that last because I love that last line so much.
Yeah, it is. It's a good line.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. What do you guys think? Because to me, it felt, I mean, hopeful in the sense that they find each other again. But there's also that sense that they're not going to see each other again.
Yeah, Joe said that there's a positive note there, more positive than negative, not super clear cut, but they do meet up together and still have some affection. Yeah, I feel like for me, it's not positive or hopeful or negative. It's there's a sort of like, there's a feeling that it's going to continue this way for a while, that maybe it's why, so before we started recording, we started talking about prepping and stuff, right? Like, we're like, oh, you need to have all this stuff on hand just in case, when the apocalypse comes to your city, whatever it is. That's kind of how that's how I felt at the end. It was not necessarily hopeful, but just like, here's a reality, and cool. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go build a bunker. Yeah.
But there was what it was to me. I mean, it was, I love that they saw each other at the end, but then if you look at that last line, they're talking about if she had an evening free, he would take her. It was a sight worth seeing. And she shut her eyes and said she would like that very much. And they rose and embraced and parted and did not know then if that evening would ever come. It's that placement of the word then. If that word wasn't there, it would be open-ended. They didn't know if they would ever see each other. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But the only time you know for certain, like, they're going to know at the end of their lives that, oh, that moment never came. So that's, to me, what that word then signified, that in fact, the moment never came. Because eventually they do. The implication to me of the word then is that eventually they do know that the moment's never going to come. Mm-hmm. So that's why, to me, it was there was a poignancy to it, and it just, again, I could be overreading, and I often do, but just the placement of that word fascinated me and changed the whole tenor of that ending.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because he did this throughout the book, where he would say years later they wondered if, or Saeed's father later would realize. Like, he did that a lot, and it was always bleak. It was never positive. So
yeah.
It was never a good thing. It's not like, oh, you're rather going to realize it's all good. That never happens.
Yeah. But I mean, that is the reality of these two. I mean, the fact that they even came together once again so long after they parted was, it actually worked. I love that. But that one encounter feels like that's more than most people get, once they part ways. And so to have it reinforce that, no, they're not going to meet again, felt real. And like you said, it wasn't negative necessarily. It wasn't positive. It just was. That's the reality. So I love that.
Yeah. Wow. Bittersweet ending.
Bittersweet.
Girl says a little hopeful. I'm like, I mean, I think it's, I don't want to say bleak, because it's not. It doesn't seem like things are going to get worse. And if anything, it's hopeful in the sense that you might survive. So cool. Because that's really what it comes down to, is, well, they survived.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Milkman and Exit West had some similarities in that, characters immersed in violence, the different tones. Milkman definitely ended on a much more hopeful note, I would say. We said that last time. People want to that discussion. But next month, we're moving away from people surrounded by violence. I hope we're moving towards an African fantasy, which I'm very excited about. So you know how like most fantasies are like medieval England? Not anymore. So next month, we're reading Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. Michael B. Jordan, who plays Killmonger in Black Panther, and I think he's also Creed, right? He bought the rights to turn this novel into a movie. So we're reading it just in time.
Ooh.
Wow. Very good.
So, as you read the book, let us know your thoughts on Twitter with the hashtag LRH Bookclub, or join our discussion group on Facebook, the Literary Roadhouse Readers. A link is provided in the show notes. Migrate your way over to iTunes, Stitcher, and Spreaker and leave a review. It helps a lot. Also, as I said, this story has turned into a bit of a prepper. People who prepare for the end of days by hoarding food and medicine. Support my apocalyptic hysteria and our podcast expenses at patreon.com/literary roadhouse. Every bit helps. All right. This was a great discussion, you guys.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. It was so much fun.
I had like a hard stop, but we're like 6 minutes over and we got to record the weekly.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, you guys, this was great.
This is so good.
Really, really fun. I am sorry about my dog. He was supposed to be upstairs sleeping. My husband let him out and wasn't supposed to. They're not even supposed to be awake yet.
You need to turn him into an Instagram celebrity.
Oh my God, that dog, I swear to God, it's as if he hasn't seen me in months every time he sees me. Every time he sees anybody. Like, whoa. Anyway, thank you guys. It was so much fun.
Thank you, Colette.
So much
All right.
fun.
Lovely to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.